everyone. This is my first time doing a PowerPoint presentation. I think I should have picked a quieter day to do it with fewer people here. And welcome to everyone on the webcast. So, the title is, as you can see, Rhythm and Rhyme. According to some scholars, the Old Testament is 1/3 poetry, and some say as much as 75%. I've studied Hebrew. I'm not fluent enough to read a newspaper or carry on a conversation, but reading the Bible is possible because of the online helps. So I thought to read some of the Psalms in Hebrew. And it's a very slow process for me, but I can manage. I was hoping to gain some insight by reading poetry in the original Hebrew language. After struggling for a while, I said to my wife, well, it's not written in iambic pentameter, you know. And she said that I was showing off by throwing big words around and asked me what that meant. Well, I was busted. I had to look it up. So, Wikipedia to the rescue. An iambic foot are 2 syllables with the accent on the second syllable. Iambic pentameter is 5 of those iambic feet in a row. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. And a simple example of this can be heard in the opening line of Shakespeare's sonnet number 12 that says, "When I do count the clock that tells the time." You feel the rhythm in that, don't you? However, I've been unable to find out why 10 syllables. Anyway, back to Hebrew poetry. I mean, I already knew that Hebrew poetry wasn't exactly like English poetry, but I thought there would be some rhythm and rhyme. Not so much. Here's a quote. "Hebrew poetry is destitute of meter in the strictest sense, and also of rhyme, though this last occurs in some isolated cases." Well, no wonder then that Western scholars, missing these marks of the poetry which they knew best, failed for so long to note the poetry with which the Old Testament is written. Well, like I said, the Old Testament is between 1/3 and 3/4 poetry, so it's surprising somewhat that Western scholars didn't even recognize that the Old Testament was filled with poetry, except for the fact that there's no rhythm and rhyme. And oddly enough, the New Testament contains virtually no poetry. I'll skip that part for now. So, well, what is Hebrew poetry then, and what kind of poetry is it? Another quote. "Rhythm, rhyme, repetitive sounds, and word plays are not easily reproduced in a translation. However, the key to appreciating biblical poetry, and indeed most of the ancient Near Eastern poetry, is none of these. It's parallelism. And I guess that's good news for people like us reading the Bible, because we all basically read it in a translation. Those poetic elements that we expect, rhythm and rhyme and repetitive sounds and word plays, for the most part aren't there anyway. So in a sense, less is lost in the translation. It's almost like somebody planned it that way. These things do exist in Bible poetry, but they aren't as important or as common as parallelism. So let's talk about what parallelism is. It's the expression of one idea in 2 or more different ways. Quote, "The content of one line is repeated or contrasted, or advanced by the content of the next. A type of sense rhythm characterized by thought arrangement rather than by word arrangement or rhyme. It's also called rhyming thoughts. So an example would be from Psalms 8, verse 4. I'll read it for you. You don't have to look it up. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? Well, basically it's just saying the same thing twice, but maybe advancing it, and without getting into, there might be a spiritual meaning to Son of Man. On the surface, at the simple, plain level, it's just saying the same thing twice. So this is an example of what's called synonymous parallelism, where two lines, line 2 repeats the same thought as line 1. Then there's also antithetical parallelism. Line 2 states the same idea in opposite terms. So no matter which way you read it, you end up with the same thought. So we'll look at a couple of examples in Psalm 1. Verse 6 says, "The Lord knows the ways of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish." Same thought, but expressed as a contrast. Again in Psalm 1, verses 3 and 4, it talks about the righteous is like a tree planted by the rivers of waters. And in verse 4, the ungodly or the wicked are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Again, same idea, antithetical. And also from Psalm 1, one that's sort of advancing the thought. Blessed is the man that walks not in the way of the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of the sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. You see how you go from walking to standing to sitting, and that the idea is advanced with each line. So, my advice is to watch for parallelism, especially when you're reading the Psalms. I was doing it this morning. I was tempted to get more and more examples of it, but they're all over. And it gives you something to watch for when you're reading the Psalms. One other type of parallelism, which I find hard to say, that I want to cover is the chiasm. But parallelism, as I've defined it, doesn't really stop with the two types, the synonymous and the antithetical. There are more types of poetic devices used. I'm just covering those two and the chiasm today. So I would encourage you to go look them up. There are plenty of references available on the internet. So let's talk about chiasms for a minute. One of the ways that the Bible organizes both prose and poetry is by a means of parallelism called the chiasm. This means a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated basically in reverse order, like a mirror image. It doesn't mean that the verses are repeated word for word, but that the idea, or oftentimes just words, are repeated. An example is going to make this a lot clearer. And if you indent the chiasmic verses, the passage will resemble the letter X. And it's called chiasm after the Greek letter chi, which looked like our English X. A chiasm tends to draw your attention to the middle verse, to the center of the chiasm. And in this way, it is like a menorah where one side balances the other. So here's my example, and the whole reason I wanted to do PowerPoint today, because this would be very hard to explain. But if the technology didn't work, I was gonna try. So Psalm 67 is a beautiful example of a chiasm, and it's called the Menorah Psalm. It has an introduction plus 7 verses. Now, if you're ever looking in a Hebrew Bible, it will have only 7 verses. The introduction is part of verse 1. So what you see here is in all your English Bibles, verses 2 through 8. And you'll notice that verses 2 and 8 are related. I got a clicker here. I can even highlight it if I can figure out how to turn this on. So, verses 2 and 8 are related, and then we indent verses 3 and 7 are related, verses 5 and 6, 4 and 6 are actually identical, and verse 5 is the center of this whole thing. So your attention is drawn to that middle verse. And just to give you verse 1, which I didn't include up here, it's to the chief musician on Neganoth, whatever that is, a song. So after that starts this chiasm. So the way this works is you notice the words bless us in verse 2, bless us in verse 8. You notice the word earth in verse 3, earth in verse 7. And I could have picked any words out of 4 and 6 since they're identical, but I thought that people praising was a good choice for that. And then verse 5 is actually a mini chiasm, if you will, because the word nation occurs at the beginning and nations at the end. So this shows you the way that this psalm is structured, focusing your attention on, for you shall judge the peoples righteously. So there's artists who have made the psalm into a menorah because it's got 7 verses, like a menorah has 7 branches. So it's actually quite clever in the Hebrew, and I'm just going to give you some facts and figures that you could, if you're going to tune out, this is the slide to tune out on. Psalm 67 is 49 words in the Hebrew, not counting the introduction, and they're arranged in this symmetrical pattern. It may not be the projector's fault. So the interesting thing is that there's also a matching of the verses 2 through 8. The number of words in verse 2 is 7. The number of words in verse 8 is 7. The number of words in verse 3 is 6. The number of words in verse 7 is 6. 4 and 6 are the same verse, and verse 5 is 11 words, 49 words. So this ties into other things, and it's a structure that you can only see in Hebrew. But because it has 49 words, quote, it has often been used in conjunction with the counting of the 49 days between Passover and Shavuot. Now, if you're paying attention, you would realize that we would say between the wave sheaf day and Pentecost. And this author also makes the argument that the priestly benediction of Numbers 6:24 and Psalm 67 are related. Let's see. There are clearly, this is a quote, clearly connections between the language of the priestly benediction and the menorah psalm. The priestly benediction starts out with, "The Lord bless you and keep you, the Lord make his face shine upon you." And verse 2 says, "God be gracious unto us and bless us and let his face shine upon us." The same phrase occurs in both. So he argues that Psalm 67 is continuing a theme that began back in Numbers 6. They are considered complementary parts of a single whole, with the priestly benediction invoking God's mercy and the menorah psalm addressing God's justice. The center verse, verse 5, where "you shall judge the peoples righteously." Okay, but we don't even need to draw that in. The menorah psalm stands on its own, so to speak. Like I said above, one's attention is drawn to the middle of the chiasm. The outer verses, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, all speak about bounty and blessings and praise to the whole earth. And I would argue that they all depend on that righteous judgment and governing the nations, the center of verse 5. Like the branches of a menorah depend on the central stalk, the blessings that go out to the nations depend on justice. And if you take it back to the priestly benediction, depend on mercy. So, back to this. The top line there is the introduction, which isn't part of the chiasm, and the bottom are the last 4 words of verse 5, and I'm sure you are all dying to know that. So, why a menorah? Well, a menorah is a lampstand, a 7-branched lampstand, and they're filled with oil. It's not candles. It's oil. It's olive oil. I've talked about how a chiasm draws your attention to the center. In Psalm 67, the main stalk or idea that supports the branches. Well, another reason for chiasms is as a memory aid, especially back when scrolls, copies of the Torah were very precious and rare. If you could remember a few words, you might be able to reconstruct the whole passage. Another way of looking at it is that God creates things in balance, and he reveals things in balance. And that balance is pictured by a menorah. The menorah is the only source of light in the holy place, in the tabernacle or the temple. So God reveals understanding in his word by juxtaposing ideas in pairs and gives light to the reader. Or you could say maybe one side of the menorah is physical, one side is spiritual. I guess the verse that comes to mind is Psalm 119, 105 that says, "Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The menorah itself is interesting. There's directions on how the temple menorah is supposed to be built. It's got to have 7 stalks, which mirror the 7 divisions of the Bible. It has 22 flowers on it. These little things here, little flowers, they're easier seen in this one over here, and they're numbered in that one. So you can see there's 22 flowers, which mirror the 22 Hebrew letters. the 22 Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament. And there's more parallels between the menorah and the Bible. You can have a little fun researching that on your own. So, there's even more about chiasms. It's not just this one psalm. I've gone through one example, and you might think, well, that's something you might find in the Psalms. Well, as it turns out, there are chiasms all over the Bible. In fact, I found a website that details chiasms in the Bible, and there are over 1,900 of them. Now, I found that a fairly surprising statistic. Some of them are small, even smaller than Psalm 67. Some span many chapters, and they may not have discovered them all. If you go to this website, which I'll give you, you can, if you find one that they don't have, you can contribute it. There are chiasms in every book of the Bible. I've looked. They're every book of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And I find all this mind-boggling. I hope that you're kind of surprised by it too. The site, I've got it listed here, is chiasmusexchange.com. And some people spell chiasm as chiasmus. And just to remember, exchange doesn't have an E on it at the beginning. I've been studying the Bible for over 40 years, and only 2 years ago found out about chiasms, and there's 1,900 of them in the Bible. I'm just amazed. There's this structure in the Bible to a degree I never imagined. Open my eyes, and I shall behold the wonders of your law. I'm not done with chiasms. So, multiple authors have noticed and written about viewing the entire Bible as a chiasm. I mean, there's certain themes that show up in a chiastic structure. And here's one example that I pulled from a book that I have at home. At the beginning of the Bible, you see a creation of heaven and earth. At the end of the Bible, you see a new heaven and a new earth. At the beginning of the Bible, you see Satan introduced. At the end of the Bible, you see him being judged, and so on and so on. You can read all of these. Now, I think it's kind of expected that at the center of any whole Bible chiasm, Jesus Christ should be there, right? Everything revolves around him and the work that he did. But this is kind of an interesting example, but I think it leaves out certain major themes that we might want to have included, say, the holy days, or the monarchy, or the temple, or, on and on. You can make your own. I don't think that this is the definitive example of a whole Bible chiasm. But I do find it interesting the way that the Bible is put together, that things that show up in Genesis also show up in Revelation. I'm not done with chiasms. On a more granular level, words and phrases from Genesis show up in Revelation, like I was just talking about, like beginning, or tree of life, or heaven and earth, and so on. And one theory is that if the books of the Bible were arranged in their original order, you could map a giant chiasm on a chapter-by-chapter basis from beginning to end. You could pair up the chapters, like here I have in the chart, chapter 1 paired up with chapter 22. Chapter 7 paired up with chapter 16. And you could go through, according to this theory, the whole Bible and make a chiasm of every chapter pair. And this is just a few representative examples. The giant whole Bible chiasm would center in on Psalm 28 as the center of 1,189 chapters. And the paper I copied this from showed dozens of examples. There are some words and phrases in common in some of these paired chapters that are just uncanny. Even from this set here, you can see that. That is, that they seem well beyond coincidence. But I'm not convinced that every chapter pair has a significant connection like that. I wrote a computer program to search for words in common between chapter pairs. Yes, I did. And I did find at least one word in common for all 594 pairs. There are a couple of chapters that only share the word God. And there are at least 14 pairs that have over 50 words in common. And I filtered out common words, okay? So these were unusual words. So how do you choose which word or words make up the chiasm? Chapter divisions are a relatively recent invention, meaning they're not part of the canon. This is a quote, chapter divisions commonly used today were developed by Stephen Langton, an Archbishop of Canterbury. Langton put the modern chapter divisions into place about AD 1227. Well, different chapter divisions would lead to different results. Is the center of the Bible determined by the number of books, the number of chapters, the number of verses, the number of words, the number of letters? I don't know the answer to any of that. But it makes for interesting browsing. So, to recap, don't look for rhythm or rhyme in the Bible. Don't do what I did. But look for parallelism, rhyming thoughts. And also, when you're looking at parallelism, look for scriptures that use the same words. You notice how we tied in Deuteronomy 6 or 24 with Psalm 67 because it used the same, let his face shine upon us. There's a lot of value, there's a lot you can learn from seeing two passages that use the same words. Look for chiasms. Read the paired verses together. Don't just read it sequentially. And with 1,900 of them that you can go and look up on Chiasmus Exchange, if you were to study a chiasm a day, you'd be at it for over 5 years. So there's plenty of material to dig out of the Bible. And if you do all this, you will behold the wonders of God's Word.